Stories of technology. Okay. Trying to get back up on my screen here so I can see. Here we go. Okay, so the goal today is to have the ability to communicate differently and effectively without compromising the integrity of the message. Basically what that means, if I came across someone and I started speaking generally something important and I realized in the middle of that discussion, they're not catching anything I say, I'm not just going to stop the conversation and move along and they missed out on that information. Let's try to find the appropriate accommodation for communication, and then we can move forward from that. And then when we do that, and how to make sure that information comes across clearly. Oh. Next slide. There we go. The term deaf versus hard of hearing. I put that up there because often the question I get is what terminology do people use when referring to people with hearing loss? I know hearing impaired was used for quite a long time, still used today. But it's about 4 years ago, there was a bill that went through the House to change all the language related to people with hearing loss from hearing impaired to deaf and hard of hearing. So the appropriate term now is someone who is deaf or hard of hearing But even that alone, there's a difference between someone who is deaf and someone who is hard of hearing. So to elaborate more on that, someone who may be hard of hearing, and you'll notice in the parentheses I put a deaf with a small letter D. This can also involve somebody who has a pretty profound hearing loss, but they're not a part of a deaf community or know a lot of the American Sign Language that is pretty prevalent among people who are in the deaf culture. There is some leeway, some gray areas when it comes to that. Myself, for example, without my hearing aids, I hear pretty much nothing. My hearing is severe enough that I can't hear any noise unless I have assistance. However, I didn't grow up in the deaf culture, but I did learn sign language over the years. I learned a different type of sign language, which you call C-sign. But as I got into college, I was exposed to American Sign Language, and now I kind of transitioned over to American Sign Language. I'm involved, a part of the deaf community, but I didn't grow up in a deaf culture. I know that's probably a little confusing, but it's pretty general for a lot of people with my type of hearing loss and who are experiencing the same thing. So anyway, who are some of these people who are hard of hearing? Different degrees of hearing loss, as I mentioned, likely raised outside of deaf culture. Many of them lost their hearing later in life, probably due to trauma, medical, or genetic reasoning. Many have either cochlear implants or hearing aids. They consider themselves a part of an oral culture, if there is such a thing. People who use speech as a main method of communication, and that could include lip reading as well. Many may have speech that is unclear or distorted, mostly because of their type of hearing loss may not allow them to hear a certain sound as clearly as others would. Many who have Meniere's or Usher syndrome, that's a disease that kind of affects the inner ear and the vision as well. And then trauma and exposure to extreme noise. Veterans that come back from overseas, they often would have a hearing loss due to the loud noises that take place out on where they've been serving. And of course, age, that is the another reasoning. Just over time, our organs like to get older and not work as much. So. Culturally deaf, I mentioned them a little bit before. Severe to profound hearing loss is very common among culturally deaf, most likely raised in a deaf culture, probably from a deaf family or a generation of deaf families. Fluent in American Sign Language, basically their primary language. hearing mannerisms. And I say that because one of the many things that deaf people and hearing people notice in common with each other is the deaf will always look at the hearing and say, how do they know when they need to do something? For example, my kids for years, when I come home from work, they would run in to greet me at the front door. And my wife, who is profoundly deaf, can't hear any sounds, would always be amazed. How did the kids know you're home? They must hear something. So she knew something was up, but she didn't know what it was. So she tried to figure it out. And finally, years later, when the kids got older, they told her, oh, the door squeaks every time Dad comes in. So that squeak had been there for years. So both my wife and I never really heard it. So that was a cue to them that somebody's home. And so that's very common in a lot of other things, like the dinging in the cars, or there's traffic behind you, or there's danger in front of you. You can hear certain noises, whether there's an airplane overhead. There's a lot of things that probably don't come across consciously, but you know that there's what's going on in your environment just because of the familiarity of those sounds. And so for a lot of people who are deaf, they see that as something, oh, that's foreign to me. I don't understand why that's important. Many are more dependent on ASL than English for communication. Many don't consider themselves disabled, will often isolate themselves from the hearing world, and often have their own self-sustaining social life separate from a hearing community. And that's very common, especially for children who are born deaf in a hearing family. Many of them will be introduced to a deaf culture and prefer to be a part of that, especially during the holidays or large events where it's a very common social event for people. It's very isolating sometimes when many don't speak the same language or use the same language, so they would gravitate towards someone that they can actually communicate with. So I'm going to jump in briefly to some slides that it's just more for information purposes. They may not have any application for what you're looking for, or they may give you something to think about. Oh, in this situation, this may be beneficial. Or if it's somewhere down the road you come across a situation, I remember Mitch talked about this, let me find out more about it. So, and that's basically technology beyond just normal hearing aids. Hearing aids themselves can do a lot of things now. As I mentioned before, hearing aids then compared to now, I can do so much more as far as using the telephone, participating and watching television shows, listening to the radio, listening to books on tape, just so many things. And all because my hearing aids can connect to my smartphone. And my smartphone, which in itself can do many amazing things. So having that connection, I'm finding myself more included in the ability to hear and participate. Like this meeting, for example, right now, being able to hear all of you, if you were to speak, the sound is actually going through my telephone because I have it connected to the Bluetooth. So when someone speaks, I can hear it inside my ears clearly. Because the hearing aids have been programmed and formed for my type of hearing loss, so it's very helpful. In the old days, I basically had to listen to speakers or to the computer speaker, and there was a lot of misunderstanding just because, sound from a source far away from me to a microphone in my hearing aids, that would often get changed or distorted based on the environment. So let me give you a list of the types of devices that we have available. ALDs, these are assistive listening devices. Pocket talkers is a pretty commonly known type of device, but there's many others like it. And that's basically just a little handheld device with a microphone and an ability to have like a plug-in so they can wear a neck loop or headphones. With the neck loop, that would work with the hearing aid that has a telecoil option. If you're not familiar with telecoil, a lot of people call it the telephone switch.
Hi, Sandy.
We can switch.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Does someone have a comment?
I think just someone with an open mic. You're good.
Oh. So anyway, just a telecoil that worked with a telecoil and a hearing aid that worked with the telecoil device. There's kind of a magnetic connection between the two, and that allowed a person with the wearing hearing aid to hear a little bit more clearly. This was a technology that was available before Bluetooth came along, which is what I'm using now. And it's still available today. A lot of the cheaper or less expensive hearing aids still come with telecoil, and they don't have the Bluetooth option. So they're still available for anybody else who needs to use it. There's shake and flash alerts, amplified alerts. It's just like the name said, alert that either shake or flash or louder. Dogs, hearing dogs, assistant animals. Somebody asked me once if they're hearing cats. There are. They're not as popular as dogs, unfortunately, if you're a cat lover. Video phones, text display phones, regular telephone with the ability to read what's being spoken. Then, of course, Android and iPhone. There's thousands of apps out there that provide almost all of the same type of services, right down to the flashing. These are apps that can be used for any type of situation if somebody would like to use it for themselves. Next one. Really quickly on assistive listening devices, I mentioned the Pocket Talker. There's also other devices that work with an FM radio system or radio waves, or an infrared system, and then of course the loop system, that's the telecoil system that I'm telling you about that works with the magnetic. The infrared works the same idea as your television remote, where you have the infrared transmitter on the front, and then the TV has the infrared receiver. These hearing devices work the same way, where the two devices have to be facing each other to receive the signal. Radios work the same way as the car radio. You have a transmitter out there somewhere transmitting the radio music, and then you have a car that's tuned into a station that picks up that sound. And so same thing with these devices. They're set with the channels to be able to have a person hear clearly from someone who's speaking in a large setting or a large room. There's lots of pros and cons for all of these devices. The most obvious cons for the infrared is the disruption between the two connections. The con for the FM, maybe if you have a private setting and you want to keep the what's being shared in the room inside the room, radio waves will travel outside. So infrared is more for the privacy. Radio would be more for just the ease of connecting without interruption. So in electro induction loops, they work with both of these devices, or they can work with the straight system itself, but you have to wear a body type device to use it. So, and just a few other things that can be used as a type of assisted technology. Computers have accessibility built into them now. You can go into the accessibility settings under your general settings, a control panel, whatever that may be. Stereo and surround systems, they're starting to become more of a type of assistant, more of just the sound, or just something that connects with another device to allow a person to understand clearly. Televisions are included with closed captioning. Phones, as I mentioned before, smartphones have a ton of apps. Alarm systems, there's more and more alarm systems available out in the general market. Many of them were designed just for general public use, but they also seem to have a accessible device attached to it. And then speakers and announcements at pulpits, the podiums, or other locations, public service announcements. You're starting to see more and more places with like a screen with the text going across. Airports now are starting to have more information on their screens, what's being announced over the PA system. UTA is starting to have more scrolling systems on their buses and so forth. So things are becoming more accessible for a lot of people with hearing loss, and it's quite beneficial even if they don't have any hearing loss, because many people find it hard to hear in loud settings. So restaurants, for example, turning on their closed captioning, a lot of people find that beneficial because it's hard to hear television in a large, loud room. So Alarm systems, there's doorbells, alarm clocks, baby criers, and even extension controls. So if you have any of these devices that flash your lights and you want to be able to control them, that's what that extension would be for. These are all available. There's lots of targeted websites for people with hearing loss, like diglo.com, or there's Amazon, eBay. I think there's probably a few other private ones out there. So if you were just to do a general search on Google or something, you can find these in almost any type of market. So, but the ones that I mentioned are the more common ones that you could find in those systems. Amplified devices, just like the name said, they're louder. They can also have a tone control. For some people with a hearing loss, high frequency noises are often the ones that are more difficult to understand. That's what I have, is a high frequency loss. And that's pretty common for a lot of people. It's just because of how the cochlea is designed. The high frequency noise is picked up at the beginning stages of the sound travel through the cochlea. And so that often gets the hardest impact when the sound comes through. So, and these amplified things can work with telephones and doorbells, or even baby cry systems. And really briefly, the baby cry system, basically it's just a sound recognition device. So it hears the baby cry and it would either make the bed shake or the light flash. And so I personally, me and my wife use that because both of us can't hear during the night. So when our children, when they were just babies, we'd had the baby cry next to their crib. And so based on, changing the sensitivity and based on their age, because newborns don't cry as loud, and then older ones, they really bellow. So we had changed the sensitivity over time to be able to pick up their noises. So. Emergency alert systems. Just one thing I wanted to point out really quickly. You've probably seen these everywhere. Due to the ADA requirements, a lot of places are now required to have a visual alert system for emergency systems, and they all include strobe lights. And these are different from most of the devices that you saw before. They use just your regular conventional light bulbs. Strobe lights are more harsh and more bright. That just for the main reasons to be able to understand that there's an emergency announcement going on. So. And then smartphones, this can do anything from sound recognition to speech to text, alarm clocks, using it for like hearing the meetings, connecting to hearing aids. They can also work with headphones. A lot of people would use their smartphone as a microphone itself. iPhones, for example, have a live listen option built in. So you activate that, and then your phone becomes a microphone. So you can place it anywhere to be able to hear what the person is speaking at a distance, either through a headphone or through Bluetooth. And that's an option available. I believe Android has the same thing. I haven't personally investigated it myself, but I've heard that the option is available. So. Home automation systems, I just threw that in there because that's becoming more and more popular with the general public. And I know a lot of people with hearing loss, they use home automation to have lights flash when there's a phone call, somebody at the doorbell, or even an intercom system, if somebody's calling from another room and so forth. They also have the alert on the phones themselves. Somebody's at your door, somebody's calling you, there's movement in your front room, they can all see it. That's also used as a sister device as well. Then, of course, dogs. These are dogs that are specifically trained to alert the master of where the sound location is coming from. Even some will have certain signals they do, lifting of the hand or poking with the nose, to then know, oh, that's the phone, that's the doorbell. Dogs are very keen on sound, so they make good resources for that type of alerts. 711 relay services, you've probably heard of the TTY. It's the old days, as I call it, basically using a typewriter to communicate over the phone. There are still a few TTYs around available, mostly among the deaf and blind population, mostly because they've used the Braille readers. And so when a person makes a relay call, they're actually connecting to a relay operator who reads what they're typing, and the interpreter speaks, and then they hear it back and they type, and the person would read it on the braille. Well, that's the service that's available. We also have video relay service. Same idea, the Zoom meetings, except I'm on the camera talking with a relay operator who understands American Sign Language. So as I'm signing, he's speaking what I say, and when the other person speaks, sign back what they say. This is pretty much what began the downward curve of TTY use, because many people who are deaf preferred the American Sign Language. And for one example, a 5-minute call on a video relay would take over 20 minutes on TTY. It's just very long and very slow. So there's also caption telephones. This is very popular among senior citizens. As they get older, it gets a little bit harder to hear on the telephone. So they can not only hear the person, but they can read what's being spoken. And that uses a voice recognition technology, but it also has an operator behind the scenes kind of making the corrections as needed. And then there's internet relay that provides the same type of services, along with voice carryover and hearing carryover. These are more for people with speech disabilities or with the sound recognition difficulties. They have a hard time. They can hear just fine, but their brain has the inability to process what the sounds mean. And same with voice carryover. If the speech is not clear, the person has been trained to make the best use of what they're saying and relay it to the other person. So then I added video remote interpreting. That's not really relay service, but the same concept. That's more for 2 people in the same room, American Sign Language users with the person speaking English. And so as the 2 are interacting with each other, there's an interpreter on screen in the room. They can hear both sides and see as well. So they would sign with the person speaking and then speak when the person is signing. So. And that just is kind of just an overview of how the video relay works. You can see the sign language user here looking at the interpreter on screen, and that's the interpreter looking at the sign language user, and he's speaking, and so forth. So. And this is the cat telephone, just a visual representation of how that works. As I mentioned before, the voice recognition technology. So the 2 are here talking to each other, they can hear everything just fine. And then what's showing up is what this operator is allowing to go by or correcting as needed. So. All right, any questions before I go into this next segment of the presentation? Need to get a little drink here. I want to talk about residual hearing. This is very important when it comes to finding the best type of accommodation for a person with hearing loss. The amount of hearing, or hearing left, as I should say, that's one way to say it. Like, for example, I wear hearing aids, but if I take them out, I do hear really loud noises if it's close by. So that means I have some residual hearing. I do have some ability to hear. And the fact that I can hear you when I'm wearing hearing aids, I do have some ability left, or residual hearing left, to be able to understand speech to a point. And so my type of hearing loss, it may be completely different from another person with a hearing loss. And based on what type of hearing loss they had, they may have different abilities when it comes to speech or understanding music or understanding sounds and so forth. So one thing that's important for a person with that knowledge is hearing aids and cochlear implants. They don't fix hearing loss, they only accommodate as best as possible. So for example, if, I believe I added a chart here. So this is an audiogram chart. And this is if you're an expert in audiology, forgive me, because I'm gonna do it pretty basic. Hope I don't kill it, but I think I understand enough that I can give you a better idea of how residual hearing works. So of course you have the overall hearing ability in the audiogram when you go to an audiologist and they check your hearing. So any sounds, oh, up here is the softness of the sound, the loudness of the volume, and the further down you go is how loud a certain sound has to be amplified in order to pick up and hear. Then on the left side, you have the high frequency, or excuse me, low frequency sounds, and then when you get over to the right side, the high frequency sounds. So of course, you know, if your hearing range is right up here above the dotted line, obviously you're going to hear all of the sounds pretty clearly, if from high to low to loudness to softness. But if you're below that, you're going to need amplification to be able to pick up those sounds. And that's what these lines represent. The blue one is my type of hearing loss. I have a pretty good average, I guess you can say, when it comes to type of hearing loss for low tones, but it doesn't have to be too loud for me to pick it up. But the higher the tone increases, the more it drops. Then all of a sudden it makes a jump, and then it drops again, and another jump, and then it drops off when it gets to high frequency, which is where my biggest weakness is, be able to hear sounds. So the red one, I threw that in there as a comparison. My wife, who is profoundly deaf, she can hear low tones at a certain loudness, but anything beyond that, she cannot hear. So how is that important when it comes to hearing sounds? And you can see where these letters are. They call this area the speech banana. There's a lot of where the sounds, the loudness, and the tones of speech take place. As you can see over here, FS and TH, the soft and more higher frequency noises, they are over in the range where I cannot hear. And so for over years of speech therapy, and you know, instruction, when you say these words, you got to remember to move your mouth to make these sounds. So I often can't hear those sounds, but I understand that I have to move my mouth a certain way to make the sound. So over the years, I always asked my parents if I could do something when it should be asked. I probably still don't say it very clearly, but hopefully it's better than what it used to be. There's a lot of other sounds like castle, pizza, windowsill, axe. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them. I could go on forever. I don't even know if I said it right, but the caption seems to be picking it up. But they are sounds that are harder for me to pick up, so I had to make a conscious effort to learn over the years to use those sounds, especially if I use speech a lot, which is I do. So. But for other noises like vowel sounds and middle consonants, they're pretty easy to pick up with hearing aids on. So then I threw these other pictures in here: visual conversation, leaves rustling, waterfall, lawnmowers, dogs barking at crabs, telephones and airplanes, as far as the loudness. So I may or may not hear these things without hearing aids, but with hearing aids I certainly can. So anybody that fall with a different type of hearing loss may not hear the same sounds just based on how the range works. So they may have a chart that goes up in the 20s, drip down to the 50s, and stays through the 50s, but they probably have more challenges in being able to understand speech because they don't cut through the speech banana as well. And because of my type of hearing loss, the ups and downs, that somehow give me the ability to hear speech a little bit better than someone who doesn't have those up and downs, which is very weird in my opinion. So, excuse me, I have a little sneeze coming on. Okay, I think I stopped it. So this is just a short example of what certain sounds appear to people with high frequency loss. So if you would try to read that, you can see it's a little challenging of what the person is saying. But if I show you the actual terms with the correct letters, you can see how having certain high frequency sound removed would make it more challenging to understand. So go back to compare again. Oops. So let me get on to who the types of people with hearing loss may be. I mentioned before, people who are culturally deaf, American Sign Language users. They are pretty much their native language or their primary language. You have bilingual users of ASL and English, like myself. I use both ASL and English. I can jump between back and forth. People who oral-centered or hard of hearing individuals may not know American Sign Language, but rely on speech, lip reading, and other cues to be able to understand the spoken word. Light deafened individuals who became deaf or have a hearing loss later in life, again, due to age, trauma, medical, genetics, and so forth. Elderly, those who lose their hearing just over time. Just my grandmother, for example, she lost her hearing as she got older because the bones in her ears became hard till they weren't as flexible as they used to be. If you know, stapes, anvil, probably one other I'm forgetting, but I used to know all the bones in my ears. So. And then there's deaf individuals who know neither ASL or written English. These are often individuals from another country, and we have a few that come here to our center. Many of them know what's called gestural signs, and there's a lot of signs that are kind of internationally known, and so communication can be formed just by basing it off the international signs and expanding from there. And then deaf-blind individuals, as I mentioned earlier, often they know American Sign Language or some form of sign language, but they often use tactile sign language. And that's basically where, if I'm the one that's signing, they would put their hand between my thumb and fingers, and on the range of motion or the location of where the signs are and my hand shape, they'd be able to understand what I'm signing. And it's pretty effective. And then persons with speech disabilities, that may include people with multiple disabilities, or just the disabilities within their vocal box or any other type of mouth speech. They may not have a hearing loss. They may hear just fine, but they often get lumped in as someone with hearing loss. I do know a few who cannot speak, but they learned American Sign Language, but they can still hear what's being said. And one of my favorite stories is I used to work at a downtown metro office at the Department of Workforce Services, and a new program called Choose to Work. And while I was in that office, I worked with a deaf clientele, and the front desk attendant came up to me one day and said that she had a customer come in and that she was trying to communicate with, and she asked if I could come up and try to help facilitate communication. So I came up and I started to sign, and the person kind of shook his head, saying he didn't understand. So he grabbed a paper and pencil, and he wrote down, and he said, I just had some dental work done. I can't move my mouth, so I'm unable to speak today. And so okay. So I read this off to her, and then she goes, oh, okay, well, can you ask him if what we can provide assistance for? So I kind of looked at her and I said, well, I turned to him and I just spoke. I said, well, we would like to know what you came in for. How can we help you? And then finally it dawned on her, oh, wait a minute, he can hear just fine. So that's kind of an example of how sometimes just speech disability often gets lumped in, or they have a hearing loss as well. So. Okay, going on to lip reading. First and foremost, I just want to put it out there. It's not a dependable source of communication or a form of communication. There's a lot of challenges that come with lip reading, not only just being able to understand what's coming across the person's lips, but what type of lip do they have, what kind of barriers, maybe a beard or mustache, the light behind them, maybe their lips move differently than somebody else that they're used to. They talk fast, they they'd have an accent. Accents actually show up on the lips. So there's a lot of different reasons why lip reading can be challenging for many. So only about 20 or 25% are effective users of lip reading. And it probably sounds like a low percentage, but it is when it comes to speaking full sentences. So a person may say 10 words in a sentence, and I would say maybe 4 or 5 of those words was actually understood by the person who's reading lips. And most times, you know, we all have brains, so we can all catch the word and put it together and rearrange it. Oh, wait a minute, they're talking about this because they said these words. And so that may be effective, or it may change what the question really was, and so there has to be a correction after that point. At that point, or there's other times they just catch the wrong words that have no understanding of what that sentence was. They say, "Well, I caught. You said store, apple, banana, potatoes. That's all I caught. I assume you wanted me to go to the store and buy those foods. But oh yeah, but there's also yogurt and eggs too, so that kind of stuff." So I'll give you some examples. The words maybe, baby, pay me. If you just speech that, it would all look the same. Olive juice, all of you, I love you, small ball, Paul. Even numbers, 15, 50, 16, 60, they all look the same. And so you can see where a lot of miscommunication can take place if someone's solely relying on lip reading. If used, and I know there are some situations where they need to lip read or they have to do it. If they have the ability to hear with hearing aids, but do have some difficulties with it, lip reading and hearing assistance together make it more effective. But when there's no hearing involved, the percentage drops drastically. I often will go out in public, especially with COVID and everybody's wearing masks. It was very challenging for me to understand people when they were wearing a mask and speaking to me. I would often ask them, say, "I will step back if you don't mind removing your mask so I can understand what you're saying." Because I could hear what they're saying, but I couldn't make it out. But if I had the lip reading, I could put the two together and understand a lot better. Communication strategies. Excuse me. Maintaining eye contact. That's pretty much number one. The eye contact, a lot can be said in non-verbally just by the look of the eyes, the movement or the expression. A lot of impact of what the words are being expressed can be carried through the use of the eyes. Use paper and pen or pencil for clarification. So if we're talking about how to install a stereo system in a wall or something, and there's some specifics that are not coming across clearly, you can use paper and pencil and say, "Oh, you need to cut in 25 inches," because that's kind of important. You don't want to cut in 50-inch squares for something that's 25 inches. Pen and paper can be very effective in making sure that important information gets across. Admit when you don't understand. I will make a confession. I've done it several times. I confess that I've often bluffed my way through conversations, most times because I may not be fully invested in the conversation. As an example, if I'm at a park or something watching my kids play and another parent comes up to me and makes a comment and points to the sky or something like that, I'm just going to assume, they're talking about the weather, and I'll just smile. But they could just be telling me, watch out, there's a lot of birds around, you don't want to get hit by anything. I probably missed that point, but at least I smile. Hopefully it's the appropriate reaction. So unfortunately, that's very common for a lot of people with hearing loss, is that they may bluff their way through it. But if there's a conversation that's very important, it's good to admit, I didn't catch that. Can you repeat yourself? Or vice versa, if you're talking with somebody with a hearing loss and you're sensing that they're not quite catching, say, "I feel like you probably didn't catch everything I said. You would just like me to repeat, or can you repeat what I just said?" So, use appropriate ways of getting attention. That is another important one. Oftentimes, verbal commands cannot be heard by a person with a hearing loss. or maybe a tap on the shoulder, a light flashing, thumping on the ground or a table, something that gives a tactile type of alert for a person with hearing loss can be beneficial. Try not to cover your face mask, for example. A lot of times, some people like to hold a pencil or a paper or the fingers or something while they're talking, and that can make it challenging. Shouting or whispering in the ear is never, ever helpful for a person with hearing loss, especially if they wear hearing aids. If you've ever, put your mouth really close to a microphone, it just sounds very breathy and muffled. The hearing aids do the exact same thing. And what's interesting too, my hearing aids, if you were to try to talk into my ear, my microphone is actually up here on the hearing aid, so they're not speaking directly into the microphone. So if they wanted to whisper in my ear, they'd have to whisper up here, not down here in my ear. So, but even then, it's still not very clear. So, and then of course, don't allow others to interrupt, especially if there's a good rhythm of communication happening. Sometimes disrupting that rhythm can just throw off the whole conversation itself. And a few other things to keep in mind if you come across someone who had the hearing loss or challenges with communication, ask them directly, what do they prefer, what works for them. As a person with a hearing loss for most of my life, I found so many things that are very effective for me to be able to understand what's going on. So a person like myself or somebody else with a hearing loss would probably have the best advice. And it's usually not very hard. Maybe something as simple as, can you put the mask down? Or can you turn so the light's on your face? Or, different things like that. So, arrange for an interpreter if requested, especially if the person's primary language is ASL. It may be more effective to have a clear communication taking place. If you're using an interpreter, speak directly to the person, not to the interpreter or talk to the person like it's a third person. Tell him, tell her, would she prefer this, would he prefer that. Give any information before any action. This is also important, especially for medical professionals. Like dentists, for example, if they're getting ready to do some work on their teeth, although some of them probably say, oh, okay, we're going to do this next and do that. But, take the mask down, say what you plan to do, and then go ahead and do the work. Because trying to do it at the same time just creates more of a shock response. So. And of course, always ask questions if you don't understand or if they don't seem to understand. So. And if you use an interpreter, please avoid families or friends. I know there's some situations, like small talk, for example, or things that are just informational, like, oh, you turn off the lights over here on that switch or do this and that. But anything that involves safety or liability or technical terms that are very important for a person to know, especially in a training and whatnot, it's good to have an interpreter in place to avoid liability. So. If you have an interpreter, as a person who may be using speech to talk with a deaf person, sit across from each other. The interpreter will most likely be off to your side, either kind of behind you, signing as you talk and so forth. So the person using the interpreter will be looking at the interpreter, but obviously they're still listening to you because they're looking at the interpreter, even though they're not looking at you. I mentioned before, don't ask him or her questions. And when the interpreter is there, they understand that their role is to be invisible, meaning they're not a part of the conversation. So if an interpreter ever becomes a part of the conversation, they would have to announce, this is me stepping outside of my role as an interpreter. So this is my input, and they would say, go back into the role as an interpreter. And that's important for the person who is deaf, because they need to know when that change is happening. If the interpreter starts to speak as himself, the person who is deaf will still think that you're saying those words, even though it's coming from the interpreter himself. And of course, during long interviews or talks, take breaks, for if there's just one interpreter, because interpreters are human, they get tired after so many minutes. 15, 20 minutes is the norm, where the integrity of the sign starts to degrade a little bit, just because it's taxing not only on the mind but the body to keep up with the sign. So that's where it's good to have team interpreters, so they can have breaks to recuperate and then go back and forth. So. All right, requesting interpreters. I put that in there because a lot of places I go to, they often ask me, where can I get an interpreter? A lot of places now, especially HR, they have that information. Admin, I believe the Board of Education has that information, very handy. Of course, we have the Board of Utah Interpreter Program here. We have a website and we have contacts here. We'd be glad to help to direct you. When it comes to do I have to hire an interpreter? The short and simple answer to that is, if you receive any type of federal fund, then the answer is yes. I've worked a lot with private businesses or other agencies trying to, or a client would come to me and say they're not providing an interpreter despite my request. And so they would call me, or I would call them, and they would say, well, it's too expensive, and give me all these reasons. And I would say, yeah, that's fine. And you can try to talk your way out of it, but you have to prove undue hardship. And so if the client were to pursue it further, they could have a case based on what happened in this situation. And then I put a $40 versus $400,000 settlement. That's just a story in this article about a lady who'd been attending a doctor for years, requested an interpreter every time. Often was denied because the doctor said it was too expensive, $40 an hour, 2-hour minimum, so forth. And so, but everything's just fine. We were able to communicate through pen and paper. Well, after so many years, the patient went ahead and filed a lawsuit, and she won because she had years of proof of the interpreter being declined. So I just said, is it cheaper to pay $40 an hour or pay a $400,000 settlement? So. Then, of course, lastly, most important, just recognize that there's a deaf culture. Many deaf customers or individuals feel uncomfortable often when they step outside of their own culture, going out into the hearing world, so to speak. They may feel more comfortable staying within. So stepping out, they often have a sense of anxiety. So when things are not going smoothly when it comes to communication, there may be a little more increased incident of misunderstandings. So then often that fear of making a mistake may help them come across misinterpreted or misunderstood, or make inappropriate decisions based on what they're feeling at that time. So try to practice thinking of other ways, two ways to communicate. So one of the best ways I can say is learn different terms, because some words are easier to understand than others. So if I'm using supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, that may not come across very well understood. Just come out with just some silly tones to help them understand what's better. So. And that's pretty much the general output of my presentation information. Just a quick overview of what we provide here at the center. These are all the services that we provide. So if you come across anybody you could benefit, we'd be happy to work with them, especially if sign language is their main method of communication. We also have a hard of hearing program, working with individuals who may have residual hearing, may not know sign language, but feel like I don't know how to advocate for myself, or I don't know how to get the services I need. They're very timid. So they provide coping classes and classes for that to help them to be more assertive in finding the type of accommodations they need to understand communication. So are there any questions? Anything I can answer? Or if there's a scenario that you would like some clarification on, I'd be happy to answer those. And if you ever have any future questions, or if you come across something, we do provide on-site consultation. Basically, you tell us your situation, have a a student or a client that comes in here and they often need help, but I wonder if they could do better with this type of thing. So we would look at the environment and then make a recommendation based on what input we have. So.
I have a question.
Sure.
So one scenario that I am thinking of is we, at our organization, English Skills Learning Center, we work with adult language learners from typically lower literacy backgrounds. And there's a particular student who fits into this category, who is an English language learner who does not use ASL, and you mentioned kind of uses more gestures to communicate. And this person's spouse has been able to help us facilitate a little bit of communication, but it's obviously not ideal. And so I guess I'm wondering, one, if you have any specific guidance for supports that we could offer as educators, and then two, if there are any specific supports that the Division of Services can offer to this individual.
Saying in a classroom setting, the person doesn't know American Sign Language or any sign language of any type, and English is not part of their language background.
Correct.
Is that correct? There's probably two different directions we can go with this. One, we do have a English as a second language sign language class. I know that sounds kind of weird because American Sign Language is in English, but they work with foreign language speaking individuals and teaching ASL to them, or even just general signs for communication. It is a foundational class. It would be, time to learn the new signs when it comes to taking a classroom setting. But that is one option there available, and they do work with families as well. So we have several Spanish speaking families. I believe we have a Bulgarian as well. I can talk with the person who oversees that program. I know they had like 18 people in their class this last term, and they taught. And so they were quite successful, and many of them picked it up pretty quickly, and so they're kind of advancing along. That may be one option that would be helpful. As far as others, when it comes to different languages, often difficult, we do have what was called a communication assessment, where they would talk with a trained professional who would sit down and talk with the student, for example, and kind of get their level of understanding of language. And it's not just sign language, but it can also be English or if there's another type of language that they use, even if it's gestural, they can make assessments based on that and then try to find strengths in supporting their basic foundation of understanding. So those are the two things that come off to my head right now, but I'd happy to check more into that unless there's something else I'm missing.
No, that is great. Thank you. How would we refer someone to services?
Well, the communication assessment, we're in the process of hiring somebody for that. So we do have one person here who does that part-time, Lori Monell. It used to be Bishop. Lori Monell, it would be the person to contact. Her email is Lori Bishop, all one word, Laurie, Bishop, BISHOP, at utah.gov. She can help set up a time to do a communication assessment. And then the other person would be Mary Beth. I can put it in the chat if that helps. Let me stop. There we go. Mary Beth. She is overseeing the sign language, English as a second language, sign language classes. And then there's Lori Bishop at utah.gov. And she's part of our CAS services program, client advocacy services. So those, they would be Lori, communications, and oops, I meant class. So those are two that hopefully can be something that can work out with this individual.
Thank you. And just to clarify, you said that ASL class is a foundational level class, right?
The ESL.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a basic foundation of learning sign language for the first time for many of them. They may know another sign language from their country. Each country have their own sign language, but most of them are learning ASL for the first time. So.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions?
It sounds pretty quiet, so I will just jump in and say thank you, Mitch, for your time today and for your expertise and sharing your experience with us, especially those resources for English language learners. That's going to be hugely helpful for some of our programs. We can stay on for a second if anybody has any additional questions, and otherwise I appreciate everybody and thank you today. The next installment of this series is in 2 weeks from today, and we'll be meeting with the Department of Workforce Services talking about apprenticeships. So thanks all.
Thank you. All right.
All right. Yeah, it looks like we've still got a few in the room, but they're quiet. So I'll just go ahead and close us out.
Okay.
All right. Thanks,
Thanks for having me on.
Yep.